a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. From Russia, with Love, novel. From Russia, with Love is the fifth novel by the English author Ian Fleming to feature his fictional British Secret Service agent James Bond. Fleming wrote the story in early 1956 at his Goldeneye estate in Jamaica. At the time he thought it might be his final Bond book. The novel was first published in the United Kingdom by Jonathan Cape on 8 April 1957. The story centers on a plot by SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence agency, to assassinate Bond in such a way as to discredit both him and his organization. As bait, the Russians use a beautiful cipher clerk and the Spektor, a Soviet decoding machine. Much of the action takes place in Istanbul and on the Orient Express. The book was inspired by Fleming's visit to Turkey on behalf of the Sunday Times to report on an Interpol conference. He returned to Britain by the Orient Express. From Russia, with Love deals with the East-West tensions of the Cold War and the decline of British power and influence in the post-Second World War era. From Russia, with Love received broadly positive reviews at the time of publication. The book's sales were boosted by an advertising campaign that played upon a visit by the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden to the Goldeneye estate, and the publication of an article in Life, which listed From Russia, with Love as one of U.S. President John F. Kennedy's 10 favorite books. The story was serialized in the Daily Express newspaper, first in an abridged, multi-part form and then as a comic strip. In 1963 it was adapted into the second film in the Bond series, starring Sean Connery. Plot: SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence agency, plans to commit a grand act of terrorism in the intelligence field. For this, it targets the British Secret Service agent James Bond. Due in part to his role in the defeat of the SMERSH agents Le Chiffre, Mr. Big and Hugo Drax, Bond has been listed as an enemy of the Soviet state and a death warrant is issued for him. His death is planned to precipitate a major sex scandal, which will run in the world press for months and leave his and his service's reputations in tatters. Bond's killer is to be the SMERSH executioner Ed Grant, a psychopath whose homicidal urges coincide with the full moon. Kronstein, SMERSH's chess-playing master planner, and Colonel Rosa Klebb, the head of operations and executions, devise the operation. They instruct an attractive young cipher clerk, Corporal Tatiana Romanova, to falsely defect from her post in Istanbul, having, she would claim, fallen in love with Bond after seeing a photograph on his file. As an added lure for Bond, Romanova will provide the British with a Spektor, a Russian decoding device much coveted by MI6. She is not told the details of the plan. The offer of defection is received by MI6 in London, ostensibly from Romanova, but is conditional that Bond collects her and the Spektor from Istanbul. MI6 is unsure of Romanova's motive, but the prize of the Spektor is too tempting to ignore. Bond's superior, M, orders him to go to Turkey. Once there, Bond forms a comradeship with Darko Karim, head of the British Services station in Turkey. Bond meets Romanova and they plan their route out of Turkey with the Spektor. He and Karim believe her story and the three board the Orient Express. Karim quickly discovers 3 Russian MGB agents on board, traveling incognito. He uses bribes and trickery to have 2 of them taken off the train, but he is later found dead in his compartment with the body of the 3rd MGB agent. At Trieste, a fellow MI6 agent, Captain Nash, introduces himself, and Bond presumes he has been sent by M as added protection for the rest of the trip. Romanova is suspicious of Nash, but Bond reassures her that the man is from his own service. After dinner, at which Nash has drugged Romanova, they rest. Bond is woken with a weapon pointing at him and Nash reveals himself to be the killer Grant. Instead of killing Bond immediately, he describes SMERSH's plan. He is to shoot Bond through the heart and dispose of Romanova after leaving a film of their lovemaking in the luggage. In addition, the Spektor is booby-trapped to explode when examined. As Grant talks, Bond places his metal cigarette case between the pages of a book he holds in front of him, positioning it in front of his heart to stop the bullet. After Grant fires, Bond collapses to the floor and, when Grant steps over him, he attacks and kills the assassin. Bond and Romanova escape. Later, in Paris, after successfully delivering Romanova and the booby-trapped Spektor to his superiors, Bond meets Rosa Klebb. She is captured, but manages to kick Bond with a poisoned blade concealed in her shoe. The story ends with Bond fighting for breath and falling to the floor. Background and writing history. By January 1956, the author Ian Fleming had published 3 novels: Casino Royale in 1953, Live and Let Die in 1954 and Moonraker in 1955. A 4th, Diamonds Are Forever, was being edited and prepared for production. That month Fleming traveled to his Goldeneye estate in Jamaica to write From Russia, with Love. He followed his usual practice, which he later outlined in Books and Bookmen magazine. I write for about 3 hours in the morning, and I do another hour's work between 6 and 7 in the evening. I never correct anything and I never go back to see what I have written. By following my formula, you write 2,000 words a day. He returned to London in March that year with a 228-page first draft manuscript that he subsequently altered more heavily than any of his other works. One of the significant rewrites changed Bond's fate. Fleming had become disenchanted with his books and wrote to his friend, the American author Raymond Chandler, "My muse is in a very bad way. I am getting fed up with Bond and it has been very difficult to make him go through his tawdry tricks." Fleming rewrote the end of the novel in April 1956 to make Klebb poison Bond, which allowed him to finish the series with the death of the character if he wanted. Breathing became difficult. Bond sighed to the depth of his lungs. He clenched his jaws and half-closed his eyes, as people do when they want to hide their drunkenness. He prized his eyes open. Now he had to gasp for breath. Again his hand moved up towards his cold face. He had an impression of Mathis starting towards him. Bond felt his knees begin to buckle. He pivoted slowly on his heel and crashed headlong to the wine-red floor. From Russia, with Love, novel's closing lines. Fleming's first draft ended with Bond and Romanova enjoying a romance. By January 1957 Fleming had decided he would write another story, and began work on Dr. No, in which Bond recovers from his poisoning and is sent to Jamaica. Fleming's trip to Istanbul in June 1955 to cover an Interpol conference for the Sunday Times was a source of much of the background information in the story. While there he met the Oxford-educated shipowner Nazim Kalkovan, who became the model for Darko Karim. Fleming took down many of Kalkovan's conversations in a notebook, and used them verbatim in the novel. Although Fleming did not date the event within his novels, John Griswold and Henry Chancellor, both of whom wrote books for Ian Fleming Publications, have identified different timelines based on events and situations within the novel series as a whole. Chancellor put the events of From Russia, with Love in 1955. Griswold considers the story to have taken place between June and August 1954. In August 1956, for 50 guineas, Fleming commissioned Richard Chopping to provide the art for the cover. Based on Fleming's design, the result won a number of prizes. After Diamonds Are Forever had been published in March 1956, Fleming received a letter from a 31-year-old Bond enthusiast and gun expert, Geoffrey Boothroyd, criticizing the author's choice of firearm for Bond. "I wish to point out that a man in James Bond's position would never consider using a .25 Beretta. It's really a lady's gun, and not a very nice lady at that. Dare I suggest that Bond should be armed with a .38 or a 9mm, let's say a German Walther PPK? That's far more appropriate." Boothroyd's suggestions came too late to be included in From Russia, with Love. But one of his guns, a .38 Smith & Wesson snub-nosed revolver modified with 1/3 of the trigger guard removed, was used as the model for Chopping's image. Fleming later thanked Boothroyd by naming the armourer in Dr. No Major Boothroyd. Plot inspirations. As with several of his works, Fleming appropriated the names or backgrounds of people he knew or had heard of for the story's characters. Red Grant, a Jamaican river guide, whom Fleming's biographer Andrew Lycett described as a cheerful, voluble giant of villainous aspect, was used for the half-German, half-Irish assassin. Rosa Klebb was partly based on Colonel Rybkin, a real-life member of the Lenin Military Political Academy about whom Fleming had written an article for the Sunday Times. The Spektor machine used as the bait for Bond was not a Cold War device, but had its roots in the Second World War Enigma machine, which Fleming had tried to obtain while serving in the Naval Intelligence Division. The idea of the Orient Express came from two sources. Fleming had returned from the Istanbul conference in 1955 by the train, but found the experience drab, partly because the restaurant car was closed. He also knew of the story of Eugene Carp and his journey on the Orient Express. Carp was a U.S. naval attaché and intelligence agent based in Budapest who, in February 1950, took the Orient Express from Budapest to Paris. Carrying a number of papers about blown U.S. spy networks in the Eastern Bloc, Soviet assassins were already on the train. The conductor was drugged, and Karp's body was found shortly afterwards in a railway tunnel south of Salzburg. Fleming had a long-standing interest in trains and, following his involvement in a near-fatal crash in 1927, associated them with danger. They also feature in Live and Let Die, Diamonds Are Forever and The Man with the Golden Gun. The cultural historian Jeremy Black points out that From Russia, With Love was written and published at a time when tensions between East and West were on the rise and public awareness of the Cold War was high. A joint British and American operation to tap into landline communication of the Soviet Army headquarters in Berlin using a tunnel into the Soviet-occupied zone had been publicly uncovered by the Soviets in April 1956. The same month the diver Lionel Crabb had gone missing on a mission to photograph the propeller of the Soviet cruiser Orjonikidze while the ship was moored in Portsmouth Harbour, an incident that was much reported and discussed in British newspapers. In October and November that year a popular uprising in Hungary was repressed by Soviet forces. Characters. To make Bond a more rounded character, Fleming put further aspects of his personality into his creation. The journalist and writer Matthew Parker observes that Bond's physical and mental ennui is a reflection of Fleming's poor health and low spirits when he wrote the book. The early depictions of Bond were based on earlier literary characters. In New Statesman, the journalist William Cook writes of the early Bond, James Bond is the culmination of an important, but much maligned tradition in English literature. As a boy, Fleming devoured the Bulldog Drummond tales of Lieutenant Colonel Herman Cyril McNeil and the Richard Hannay stories of John Buchan. His genius was to repackage these antiquated adventures to fit the fashion of post-war Britain. In Bond, he created a Bulldog Drummond for the jet age. Following on from the character development of Bond in his previous 4 novels, Fleming adds further background to Bond's private life, largely around his home life and personal habits. With Bond's introduction to the story seeing him at breakfast with his housekeeper, May. The novelist Raymond Benson, who later wrote a series of Bond novels, sees aspects of self-doubt entering Bond's mind with the soft life he has been leading when he is introduced in the book. Benson identifies Bond's fear when the flight to Istanbul encounters severe turbulence from a storm, and notes Bond's apparent nervousness when he first meets Romanova. He seems concerned and guilty about his mission. The other characters in the book are also well developed, according to Benson. He considers that the head of the Turkish office, Darko Kerim Bey, is one of Fleming's more colourful characters. Kerim is a similar type of dependable and appealing ally that Fleming also created with Quarrel and Columbo. Parker considers that Kerim is an antidote to Bond's lethargy, while the essayist Umberto Eco sees the character as having some of the moral qualities of the villains in the series, but that those qualities are used in support of Bond. From Russia, With Love is one of the few stories by Fleming in which the Soviets are the main enemy, although Eco considers Bond's Russian opponents so monstrous, so improbably evil that it seems impossible to take them seriously. Fleming introduced what was a new development for him, a female opponent for Bond, although much like the former adversaries in the series. Rosa Klebb is described as being physically repulsive, with poor hygiene and gross tastes. Eco and Anthony Sinnott in his examination of aesthetics in the Bond novels, consider that despite Cleb being female, the character is more akin to a sexually neuter individual. Red Grant was Fleming's first psychotic opponent for Bond, according to Benson. Charlie Higson, who later wrote the Young Bond series, finds Grant to be a very modern villain, the relentless, remorseless psycho with the cold dead eyes of a drowned man. Style. According to Higson, Fleming spent the first 4 novels changing the style of his books and his approach to his characters, but in From Russia with Love the author finally hits on the classic Bond formula, and he happily moved into his most creative phase. The literary analyst Leroy L. Panak observes that the previous novels were, in essence, episodic detective stories, while From Russia with Love is structured differently, with an extended opening picture that describes Grant, the Russians and Romanova before moving on to the main story and then bringing back some of the elements when least expected. The extensive prose that describes the Soviet opponents and the background to the mission takes up the first 10 chapters of the book, and Bond is only introduced into the story in Chapter 11. Eco identifies that the opening passage introducing Red Grant is a cleverly presented beginning, similar to the opening of a film. Eco remarks that Fleming abounds in such passages of high technical skill. Benson describes the Fleming sweep as taking the reader from one chapter to another using hooks at the end of chapters to heighten tension and pull the reader onto the next. He feels that the Fleming sweep steadily propels the plot of From Russia with Love, and, though it was the longest of Fleming's novels, the sweep makes it seem half as long. Kingsley Amis, who later wrote a Bond novel, considers that the story is full of pace and conviction, while Parker identifies cracks in the plot of the novel, but believes that the action moves fast enough for the reader to skim over them. Fleming used known brand names and everyday details to produce a sense of realism, which Amis calls the Fleming effect. Amis describes the imaginative use of information, whereby the pervading fantastic nature of Bond's world is bolted down to some sort of reality, or at least counterbalanced. Themes. The cultural historians Janet Willicott and Tony Bennett consider that Fleming's preface note, in which he informs readers that a great deal of the background to this story is accurate, indicates that in this novel, Cold War tensions are most massively present, saturating the narrative from beginning to end. As in Casino Royale, the concept of the loss of British power and influence during the post-Second World War and Cold War period was also present in the novel. The journalist William Cook observes that, with the British Empire in decline, Bond pandered to Britain's inflated and increasingly insecure self-image, flattering us with the fantasy that Britannia could still punch above her weight. Willicott and Bennett agree, and maintain that Bond embodied the imaginary possibility that England might once again be placed at the centre of world affairs during a period when its world power status was visibly and rapidly declining. In From Russia with Love, this acknowledgement of decline manifested itself in Bond's conversations with Darko Karim when he admits that in England, we don't show teeth anymore, only gums. Willicott and Bennett argue that in selecting Bond as the target for the Russians, he is deemed the most consummate embodiment of the myth of England. The literary critic Meyer Sternberg sees the theme of St. George and the dragon running through several of the Bond stories, including From Russia with Love. He sees Bond as St. George, the patron saint of England, in the story, and notes that the opening chapter begins with an examination of a dragonfly as it flies over the supine body of Grant. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?